This week, our astrological community lost a great astrologer and scholar, Dr. J. Lehman. Lee was an amazing teacher and a scholar, and many of our dear colleagues were told by her. I feel so blessed I met her in 2015 at the AA conference, and then I found her book, Astrology of Sustainability, is a pioneering and inspiring book. So in 2022, I organized a whole series of Mundane astrology webinar about Pluto in Aquarius. Lee was taking part of it and inspired us. Today, in honor of her, I would like to share part of this recording and let us be inspired by Lee's wisdom once again.
Okay, so this is research which actually I started doing when I was preparing Rod's favorite of my books, Astrology of Sustainability, because that's the mundane one. So I understand what his interest in it is. So I want to, now the funny thing was, when I was working on Astrology of Sustainability, it basically had two background pieces. And one was talking about Pluto through the elements and the signs, and the other was talking about looking at Aries ingresses from a classical standpoint. Well, what was rather hilarious in retrospect was a couple of years ago when Wendy Stacy had talked to me about doing Pluto and Aquarius as a topic for an upcoming AA conference. I thought to myself, well, this is going to be easy. All I have to do is pull up my notes from Pluto, from the Pluto section of Astrology of Sustainability. And I have my lecture, except that then I discovered I never actually wrote up Pluto and Aquarius, which probably we could consider an interesting little Freudian slip. So this is part of the material that kind of replaces what I should have done about 20 years ago. So there we go. Most in looking at Pluto, of course, one of the things we probably don't remind ourselves as frequently as we should is that the amount of time that Pluto spends in a sign is radically different according to what sign it is. And so what we know is that historically, Pluto spends the least amount of time in Virgo and Libra, closely followed by Scorpio. And then the longest period of time in the area of Aries and Taurus. So there we are at Aquarius, which is on the way to being longer. And of course, it will spend longer in Aquarius than spent in Capricorn. Roughly speaking, the length of time by sign in Pluto and Capricorn is about 15 years. It's about 20 years for Pluto and Aquarius and about 25 years for Pluto and Pisces. So we're in the phase where you just have to like the next sign better. This is another way to look at it. This shows actually the amount of time between the different Pluto passes is again not quite constant, but fairly similar as far as intervals historically. And I'm actually going to be going back one Pluto cycle past the 1286 to look a little bit at the 800s. But you can see roughly this happens every 220 some years. Now, this chart basically shows the length of time of the last few cycles of Pluto in the various signs. And so you can see a couple things. We'll go back and we'll talk about this 1286 time a little bit today, as well as the 1532 time. We're actually going to go back to 842, just why not, before we talk about this immediate past that will start next year. But you can also see that every one of them is associated, not surprisingly, with retrograde periods. It's rare to get a degree that Pluto doesn't retrograde past in a particular past. So there you have the approximations. Now, if you're just looking at this quickly, if you see the one from the 1770s and you happen to have any US blood in your veins, you're immediately thinking, US Revolution. But of course, if you are also acquainted with European history, you realize it's also taking in the French Revolution, or a piece of it, to be exact. That passed in the 1770s into the 1790s, was actually had one of the more complicated retrograde cycles as far as going in and out of the sign. Now, one of the things I started to think about, and unfortunately, sometimes we overdo the question of how unique our own time period is. And so, of course, since we've just spent so much time talking about the mutational cycle of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions into the air signs, one of the things that is extremely striking is that next year, Pluto, when it ingresses into Aquarius, is going to immediately or almost immediately hit the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle and the degree of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from December 2020. And I think we all remember, of course, that 2020 was one of those years that in retrospect is going to be a little tough to forget. So one of the things that struck me about this is that we may actually see more of an effect when Pluto starts getting to closer to the exact hit to 0 Aquarius 29, which was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, than the hit at 0, And when we're dealing with something as slow as Pluto, this exact hit, as opposed to the theoretical 0, may be a more obvious phenomenon. And let me also, while I mention that, remind us all that the Pluto cycle is not as astronomically, shall we say, fixed or well known to astronomers as the other cycles are. The level of accuracy in Pluto's orbit, even though we've now got satellites that have gone out there, has not been as great. And so there are legitimately different equations for Pluto's orbit. It's not a huge difference, but when something's moving at the kind of speed of Pluto, even a tiny little difference in the orb can represent days or weeks. So I would caution that what's likely to happen when we're getting into next year and, oh, Pluto's in Aquarius now. Actually, Pluto may be in Aquarius a little early, it may be in Aquarius a little late. And the amusing thing for us as astrologers is we're not the ones who are going to know in advance, because it's this kind of distancing is much more difficult to measure than when you're dealing with, say, the Ptolemaic planets, where there's much more certainty to the orbits. So be prepared to not expect precision to the level of day in the accuracy of the Pluto orbit. That said, we have a very interesting phenomenon, which look there at 2 May 2023 and 2 May 2024. What you see there is that Pluto is reaching its retrograde station at 0 Aquarius 21, just short of the actual degree and minute of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from 2020. So now, am I saying that, oh, well, nothing's going to happen? Of course, I'm not saying that nothing is going to happen. We have to, of course, something will happen. But the actual presumed crossing of Pluto of that degree and minute isn't going to be for about a year later. So this is really pretty outrageously interesting. Here we have we all got to be alive for this mutation from the earth signs into the air signs. So, yes, yay us. But now we're going to have Pluto coming up there and activating the point again. So what this little table is meant to show you is this idea of a Pluto transit to the point of a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction within the time period, roughly around the time that the conjunction occurs. is actually quite rare. I didn't just put these three up because I was interested in talking about Pluto and Aquarius and Pisces. This is it, folks, for when this has happened since 800. So this phenomenon of Pluto and a Jupiter-Saturn is actually quite rare. And, I would add here that these are, the other two are not mutational changes. So in this particular case, I think we can argue the point that we're living in, at the very least, let's say, a less usual time as a result of this. So yes, there's quite a bit to note about this. And obviously this station point at 0, followed by a retrogradation back into Capricorn, and of course then turning stationary direct, going back, and then finally getting past the Jupiter-Saturn point, suggests at the very least a more active and possibly a more dramatic effect both of Pluto and of reactivating the Jupiter-Saturn again. So now I'll also mention, because this is directly relevant to the theme of this whole symposium series that Rod's put together. When you look at the Pluto cycle is not really an independent cycle, because Pluto and Neptune are in a 2 to 3 harmonic relationship to each other. This is generally true with Neptune and we can call them the Plutoids or the Plutinos, that group of Kuiper Belt objects of which Pluto was the first to be discovered. Neptune has a gravitational effect on that whole region of space. And so there's a tendency for many of these bodies to be in a 2 to 3 relationship. What that means on a practical level is that that cycle runs about 490 in the 490 year range, just a little under 500 years. When you look at charts from this range going back, it's actually quite shocking, because you'll see Neptune and Pluto in just about the same places you're used to seeing them in with charts now, only it's roughly 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So what's going on with Pluto is not independent with Neptune. But what it means when you're in a 3 to 2 relationship is that if Pluto now, as it's going into Aquarius, shortly Neptune will go into Pisces. And then you'll have Pluto in Aquarius, Neptune in Pisces. But if you go back to the previous Pluto in Aquarius piece, what you'll see is Neptune in Virgo. And so you have to go back 2 Pluto cycles to get back to Neptune and Pisces again. So there's also this piece of what Neptune's about to do as far as changing signs as well, because this is how the Neptune-Pluto cycle works, and it's how it's aligned within the solar system. So this is a normal pattern that we can look at over centuries. Okay, well, just to kind of put this in perspective, because we can line up the Pluto and the Neptune degrees, you can get pretty much year comparisons between this Neptune-Pluto cycle. This is the almost 500 year one you see here. And so if we do that, so the period 1528 to 1529, Pluto was in Capricorn, Neptune was in Pisces, Uranus was in Gemini, and Saturn was mostly in Taurus. 2019 to 2020, Pluto in Capricorn, Neptune in Pisces, Uranus in Taurus instead of Gemini, Saturn mostly in Capricorn. It was a period of time where you had peasant uprisings, and you had something called the sweating sickness in England. It was a European epidemic which lasted about 2 years. The mortality was extremely rapid when people were infected, and in some areas there was 50% mortality. What's interesting is the sickness completely disappeared within a little more than 20 years. Nowadays, the scientists who studied this think it might have been a hantavirus. But, not surprising, it was a virus of some sort. It just wasn't COVID. But the timing is certainly, as we may say, intriguing. A couple of things that suggest to us. I wish I could say that the sickness completely disappeared only 2 or 3 years later. It was a little longer than that, which suggests that we may not be done with COVID, although we're probably done with the worst of it. Now, just so you get a chance to look at the charts and see what I'm talking about, you can see down here that you've got this is for the Aries ingress in 1528, and you can see the developing pattern there with Pluto at this point is a 24 Capricorn. Doesn't that look a little familiar? You'll see Pluto at 24 Capricorn, which is exactly what we were looking at in the midst of the height of COVID. You can see Saturn there in the 2020 chart at 29 Capricorn, going forth to the conjunction with Jupiter. And of course, Jupiter is a few degrees behind because many astrologers had also noted the importance of the Jupiter Pluto that year, as well as the Saturn Pluto. So they were dancing with Pluto in Capricorn before the Jupiter Saturn occurred in Aquarius. Now, what happened in that immediate aftermath, which of course is the period that we're in right now, was one of the big news pieces was what Henry VIII was doing with the Church of England. He was desperate to divorce his wife, Catherine, since he had no male heir. And so it was in this period of, right now, that Henry declared himself the head of the Church of England and gave himself the right to divorce Catherine. And he was in the midst of dating Anne Boleyn. So what we have going on in the meantime in the US, of course, is we've just had the midterm elections, which has produced a probable 2-year political stalemate. We've got the Ukrainian war, enough said about that. We have the death of Elizabeth II, and we've had the meltdown of the British economy. And the effect of China's policy on COVID has significantly reduced their economic growth. It's been a busy time, as we say. Now, the idea of the death of monarchs as being associated with Jupiter-Saturn cycle changes is an old one. And certainly what we saw globally with the death of Elizabeth II is quite a global response to her death. That wasn't just the British people themselves, and wasn't even just the Commonwealth itself. So we're just moving into this period, 1532 being 2023. And you see here how this parallel is working so perfectly. You've got Pluto in Capricorn going into Aquarius in both years. Neptune is in Pisces. We've got Uranus, and so you've got two that are the same. Uranus is in a different sign. Saturn is in a different sign, but you see it's in this case, it's in a trine. And the one in 2023, it's in the midst of going into Pisces, as Rod noted. This is a period of time in which several things happened in Britain that were relevant. Henry VIII formed an alliance with Francois, the first of France, which is interesting because at this period of time, Francois, of course, was Catholic, as was Charles V. So even as there is this building idea, Protestantism already exists. Henry is insisting he's not Protestant, but that he's in charge of the Church of England. And Francois is feeling powerful enough within himself to move against another Catholic monarch because, of course, it's convenient for him politically. In this period that it corresponds to, just as Pluto is going into Aquarius, Henry marries Anne Boleyn secretly, and which he had to do at the time because the Pope had told him to end the relationship, and he was not going to end the relationship. So now we're getting right to that point of change. And so here you see Pluto in the 1532 Aries ingress, just having moved into Aquarius. And in our case, the one that we're just going into for the Aries ingress, the Pluto is still at 29 Capricorn 57. So it will happen in the same year, but the cycle is running a little bit behind on our current schedule as far as Aries ingresses is concerned. So the following year after that, the 2024 year, you'll see that now Pluto is retrograding back into Capricorn, then coming back into Aquarius. So as Pluto becomes fixed into Aquarius, pardon the pun, Henry VIII is excommunicated after publicly marrying and crowning Anne Boleyn, because of course she's pregnant, and she gives birth to the earlier Queen Elizabeth, the last Tudor monarch. So you can see how the cycle is working then, which should be giving us some ideas for now. Volatile. And yet, when you were looking at it from the perspective of we're just about to go into a period of air, which the idea of gold as a standard of currency is just so very earth, whereas crypto seem to be just beautifully air. This may not be true. At this point in time, it's not, you can see it's not fixed. Now, what could easily happen in this period is something like the official electronic currencies, the e-money, may turn out to be here to stay, even though they are somewhat behind the development of crypto itself. But in either case, both of these ideas, the cryptocurrencies and electronic currencies, challenge the earth-based view of what has intrinsic value. So whether that particular technology of it survives is probably of less long-term concern than the fact that a metals-based currency is being challenged. Okay, now, of course, we talk a lot now about climate change, but this is not new. Even Ezra talked about the fact that the fiery and Aries signs signify a high price for wheat and famine in the world, and particularly the signs where they meaning Jupiter and Saturn, conjoin. So this makes a whole lot of sense because the diurnal signs are considered drier and hence less fertile than the nocturnal signs. So within that change from earth to air, there is that suggestion of a level of climate change. Obviously, we're doing it now for many additional reasons, but it's a thought. So if I were to fill out some ideas about the agenda of the air periods, historically, these periods have represented times where education has tended to improve and increase. This has in turn brought about a greater level of equality. I'm using the word secularization here in quotation marks because what you've seen by what we've talked about is in the era, it may not be secularization, but let's say less religious unity would probably be the way to put it. There seems to be a trend toward more universality, but remember that universality is not necessarily equality, nor is it necessarily democratic. Climate issues do seem to be a focus. And this is just as simple as weather, since it mainly occurs in the air, shows more changeability. And reality tends to move from a sense of stability to one of change. Again, what air is more volatile than Earth on a general pattern. Now, one of the odd things, and a lot of astrologers have commented about this over the years, is this whole concept of what is fixed air anyway? Because if air is really literally the air, if it's the weather, how can the weather be fixed? Because weather is not fixed. And yet here we have the daytime domicile rulership of Saturn in Aquarius. So it's definitely an interesting contradiction. The now Saturn in Capricorn, its other domicile sign, has represented historically a time of great political change. But what you also have is a very strong focus on material matters. As Saturn moves into Aquarius, the ability to hang on to or latch on to that materialism becomes attenuated. And of course, even more so in this period, because it's also the mutational change. So having come so recently from the retrogression of the conjunction, you've got this tension that develops between the desire to preserve that which has so recently been broken with the tendency to want to move on to the new thing. But basically, right at this point, because of the mutation, there is no choice. So, what all this is leading to is, do we really think that this is just going to go away? And as a few people have called it, we're going to just sing Kumbaya. If we look at these periods of transition, this changeover from Capricorn and eventually to Pisces. So through the two signs, the two domicile signs of Saturn, you've got the period. Historically, this is the period of the most discourse, and then it gets exaggerated somewhat by the mutation to air that is occurring, and it looks like this is also a period with climate change, which may be what substitutes for global exploration that was happening the last time. But the period of air is not historically a time for solving a problem. It may be a time for becoming aware more of the problem, of discovering its facets, of discovering its complexity, of trying to understand it. But historically, it's not when we solve it. So what that suggests is that if we can't solve the problem now, and I'm suggesting we have a low probability of being able to solve it, what we can try to do, and this kind of is to a degree our choice, is that we need to get away from doing more to rip the fabric apart by increasing the distance and try to dampen the divisions. And there, part of this also is when you think about it, Earth is cold and dry. Air is hot and wet. There is no quality which has maintained itself in this transition. So these ones where there's no similarity in quality between the two are going to be, by definition, the bigger shifts. They're going to be the ones that are harder to just pretend nothing happened. So we're in the midst of change. We're in the midst of a lot of global disagreement. What we don't need to do is anything which promotes even more disagreement, because I think we will be doing well to have tamped down and worked toward consensus in the air period, even if we don't achieve it entirely. So that's where I think we're at. And I've just talked for an hour.